Good afternoon. My name is Jordan and I'm the Sales and Marketing Manager of Pelicano. It's an award-winning developer for 50 years. And I'm really excited today to be able to hear our experts discuss the alternative ways of making money in the current challenging market. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel members for this session. So we've got Dr. Andrew Wilson, renowned Chief Economist of My Housing Market. Maybe wave for us, maybe, so we know who you are. We've got Rich Harvey, Property Buyer CEO and founder, and also TV presenter. Okay. We've got Guillaume Volz, National Director, Residential Development Sites of Collies International, down the end over there. And Ian Ugarte, founder of Small is the New Big. And of course, our moderator, Rob Flux, property developer, educator, and mentor at the Property Development Network. So now I'll hand it over to Rob Flux. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everybody. Whilst this is I guess a question and answer session, I want you guys to think of some questions on notice to put these gentlemen towards the end. So I've got some structured questions, but very much encourage you to interrogate them as hard as I'm going to. That said, guys, I'm going to start very gently. So I'm going to start with Andrew, if that's okay. I don't think you're on.
I push the button and then I'm on. Hello.
Very good. So Andrew, what's your opinion on the current negative outlook sentiment that's in the market right now?
Well, look, Rob, it is a remarkable market at the moment. I'm a little perplexed, which is a little unusual for me. But really, I think that we've sort of come into spring with, I guess, a certain amount of momentum. Clearance rates increased at auction and listing numbers increased through August. And things were sort of going along steadily, certainly well below last year, and we shouldn't be surprised at that because we've come off a very strong market environment in Sydney. In fact, near record levels of activity. The Sydney median house prices increased by 10% still per year over the past 5 years. Now that's a great result if you've been a homeowner during that period. But October came along and it was all bets are off. And the market has certainly backtracked quite sharply over the past 4 weeks. I don't want to get onto the hobby horse of the media, but and look, I'm an integral part of the media, and I try to be balanced in my commentary. But I don't know if you remember the 60 Minutes show, the 60 Minutes show. Well, that was a Sunday night thing, and the Monday after that, I've never been so busy. It's like 40% fall in price. I said, relax. But it was quite interesting that I think that show tapped into some significant underlying fear that a lot of buyers and sellers already sort of had about, look, it's been so good, it's coming to an end, but it might be worse than we thought it would be. And it's very easy to talk yourself into that sort of a position. It becomes almost self-perpetuating, because buyers obviously think, well, I'm not going to buy now because prices might be cheaper next year. And sellers think, well, I'm not going to sell now because there are no buyers around. And then it sort of, accelerates. And there's always buyers and sellers who have to buy and sell, or have to sell because, a divorce or death, or they're moving interstate or international transfers. So they have to take what the market's offering. And if that's low, it shows us again that prices are falling, people say, well, prices have fallen again. And that increases the confidence. But confidence is something that's very difficult to shift, particularly negative confidence. I always equate it to the big ship that's sort of sailing, steaming in one direction, and it's very difficult to turn that ship around, particularly negative confidence. And the thing that would turn it around would be a stimulus, either a strong economic activity or a cut in interest rates. Now, we're not going to get either of those things because the real issue in our housing market is all the fundamentals are actually really good. It's like, hang on guys, we've got the lowest unemployment of all the capital city markets. Sydney's unemployment rate is probably going to have a 3 in front of it sometime next year on current trends. We're creating nearly 100,000 new jobs a year. We've still got very strong migration coming into Sydney. We've had an extra 12,000 first home buyers over the past year compared to the previous year. And of course, we've got the lowest interest rates we've ever had. And they're not going up from the Reserve Bank. In fact, they might have to cut them next year. So all the things that you would expect to be influencing the housing market in a negative way are all positive. And yet we have these issues of confidence. And, it obviously takes, and that's the theme, I guess, for the panel, a mindset of tackling what is a soft market and take advantage, particularly in developments, of what is the peak of the supply cycle, but taking that medium to longer term view. But it is a remarkable market. We've got 4 weeks till the end of the season. Really, buyers and sellers have headed for the hills, and developers are really looking for any opportunity they can to shift their stock. But the thing that I'm concerned about, and I'll finish off now, I don't want to go on and on, but
I was just going to remind you.
Oh, sorry, mate. No, but this is my talk in an hour. So. But the thing that concerns me is we've got a New South Wales general election in March, and then we've got a federal election in the middle of next year. Now, these are the things that continue to work their way into negative sentiment. I'm going to wait and see what happens. There's always a lot of, argy-bargy that goes on. Of course, we may get the polls tell us we may get a new government, federal government next year, and that means perhaps negative gearing. Again, regardless of what that might do, it's not a debate about that. It'll still be a process. People say, we're going to wait and see what happens of that. So it's, really a market that's worked itself into almost a crisis of confidence. But again, I think, buyers who recognise, and I'm not here to spruik it up, but it's just logical that buyers recognise that all the fundamentals are very strong here. It's remarkable that over the medium to longer term, Sydney's going to remain the jewel in the crown of Sydney property.
Right. It reminds me of a quote from Warren Buffett, which isn't really property related, but be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. So this is a perfect time
what a good point.
taking advantage of that. So thank you for that, Andrew.
Thank you, Ron.
Guillaume, you sell a lot of development stock, I guess, to the larger developers around town. Are they taking advantage of some of this poor sentiment at the moment and buying up well-priced properties?
Oh, look, I mean, the developers, their business is developing. They have to keep buying throughout the cycle. So yes, they're taking advantage, but they're making astute purchases in strong core areas. So they're managing their pipelines beyond 2019 to 2020. So a lot of developers we talk to, whether small astute developers or large institutional developers, know that there's a turn coming around the corner at some point, and most people we talk to now are gearing up to buy development sites that can come into the market in late 19 and early 20. So they're looking through the current negative sentiment. They're active in the market at the moment with the current stock, but we sell continually through the cycle. It's more about where they're looking to buy and the type of stock they're looking for the next period of time.
Very good. And similarly to yourself, Rich, I guess you're a buyer's agent. Do you agree that there are opportunities in the market right now, especially for the smaller developers like the people who have got in the crowd here, so smaller investors, to buy in the right locations, given those economics?
Yeah, despite the headwinds of elections and negative sentiment and tight credit controls, there's absolutely opportunities. I think everyone's deciding, should I sit on my hands and do nothing, or should I get active in the market? But if you can read the market psychology and read the buyer and seller psychology, some of the best times to buy, for me personally, has been during things like the GFC, when there's no competition. I love it when there's no competition around because I can buy so much better. I'm able to get much bigger discounts for my clients. As a buyer's agent, I help home buyers, I help investors, I help developers, and I help commercial buyers. And 2 years ago, it was everyone get out of the way, and whoever's the highest bidder gets the property. But now, a lot of properties are being passed in. We're able to negotiate good discounts. But what you have to be very, very careful of as either a home buyer or investor here today is not to overpay for the property. It can be very easy to get caught up in that emotion of the process, not do enough research and overpay, because the market may have a couple of % more to fall. Sorry to be negative, but there may be. But if you're a home buyer, it's actually easier to buy in a downward market than an upward market, because what you lose in the sale, you more than make up for in the buy. So my advice is to buyers out there to do your homework, be very cautious, be unemotional about what you're buying, and make sure you buy in high demand, low supply suburbs. One of the things you've got to look at is the volume of stock coming onto the market in a particular suburb. it's very important to understand the microeconomics of a particular area that you're buying into, because they can have a dramatic effect on the long-term value. But if you do, as Andrew said, take a long-term view of the market and you buy in areas that have the right fundamentals, you can do very well.
Thank you. Ian, with regards to yourself, you're adding value in the process, but as I understand it, you're looking less for the actual capital growth side of things and more from the cash flow side of things. So how does that play out in this sort of market?
Yeah, I mean, strategies that I use don't necessarily mean that I'm not looking for capital growth. I'm always looking for capital growth. But the myth in Australia is that you can't do capital growth and cash flow at the same time. And, you know, when you hit the right market, at the right marketplace, at the right time, you're always going to get an outcome that's really beneficial to everyone. You know, there's no doubt in my mind that I believe that people that buy properties are not educated. They actually don't go out and understand why they're buying a property and where they're buying it. And as Rich said, 2 years ago, there was a whole bunch of people that were buying for the maximum price with no strategy whatsoever except let's spend as much money as we can. And so for me, I just simply say, if I can get capital growth from anywhere and sit on a property with the cash flow, even if I don't get the capital growth, even if, you know, as Andrew said a month ago, that the market turned sideways, if I've got cash flow coming in, I don't care if it turns sideways for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, because I've got constant cash flow coming in. And when you hit a marketplace that really needs it, so currently right now, 80% of the people looking for rental accommodation are singles and couples, and 80% of the stock that we've got is 3, 4 and 5 bedroom houses. So you have to be really strategic about making sure that you're catering for the needs of the singles and couples, not for the families, because we've got enough family homes. And so ultimately, capital growth is very, very important. Manufacturing your growth, very important. And understanding why you're buying a property is probably the most important part of it all.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. So, Andrew, you already touched on this somewhat before with your somewhat lengthy original answer.
Try more brief. I won't.
I guess construction, the amount of construction underway at the moment is dropping.
Yes.
Population growth is still growing.
Yep.
Surely that supply and demand, as you said, those fundamental economics are going to get to a point where that market is going to push back of its own volition. How long till you see that, and are there other factors that are going to play into that?
Well, look, that's the point, that confidence can only take a market so far. As long as the fundamentals are positive, you know, negative confidence versus positive fundamentals, eventually that will have to right itself in, you know, in a legitimate or a logical manner, and that's what we will see eventually in Sydney. And that's why I think that this sort of confidence conundrum has probably got about 12 months to run. Now, we are definitely at the peak of the supply cycle now in terms of completions. If we look at the approval cycle, however, Sydney's approved 5,000 fewer apartments this year so far compared to the same period last year. So although on-the-ground stock is very strong at the moment, the pipeline has diminished considerably, and yet we have around about demand for roughly 1,100 new households every week in Sydney. New households. First-home buyers, those numbers are very high at the moment. They will gradually ease, but still it's a good environment for first-home buyers because prices are softening. Migration is strong, and that again, even though it's eased slightly, is a key driver of demand for housing. People will not be living in the streets, you know. I mean, this is just demand eventually will overtake any of that negative sentiment. And of course, the joker in the pack, Rob, is always interest rates. And I think the Reserve Bank is probably a little concerned that they've painted themselves into a corner in terms of the prospect for interest rates, because they have been saying quite clearly for a while now that they believe that the next move in interest rates will be up, even though they say that's some time to come. But the economic drums are beating louder and louder for an interest rate cut. We have unions are marching in the streets now demanding wage rises. Retail sales data out yesterday was dreadful. Inflation rate numbers out on Wednesday were dreadful. And of course we still have the highest interest rates just about in the world. So we've got room to move, And I think if they had their druthers, the Reserve Bank would have liked to have brought back the Melbourne Cup tradition of an interest rate cut next Tuesday. But I do think that it is getting more and more, the argument for a cut is getting stronger. Not that I think that'll make much of a difference to the economy or the housing market, but it'll certainly put to bed any of those concerns about an increase in interest rates. And even though the banks have dabbled with increases over the last couple of months, it has been marginal, and it has been to existing mortgage holders rather than new clients. And I think what we've got to also do is start asking some hard questions of the banks. Exactly why are they tightening? Why are they tightening lending? What's the problem here, guys? You know, are you crazy? You lend, you know, you decide not to lend anymore. What, you're going into another business here? You know, and why? Because you're creating the very environment that, you know, validates lower lending because prices are falling. And I think we need to start from the Royal Commission having some arguments about lending. Banks have a privileged position, I'm going to finish now, in our society, and I think there must be more of a public good argument for the way they distribute their lending, not just for consumers but also for the industry, you know, not just some, let's, you know, not lend anymore, and who cares about the consequences.
Thank you. I might put a buzzer on it next time.
I was pretty quick.
That was not quick.
Oh, sorry.
So Guillaume, I guess with some of your larger developers in town, what are some of the lessons that apply at the big end of the town that are really going to apply to people like our audience at the smaller scale side of things?
I think that the main thing you should learn from the big developers and the experienced guys is discipline. We spoke about research before, understanding what the primary drivers are in that market. You know, who's buying, who's going to be buying in a couple of years' time. So, I mean, one thing's doing the research on the property and finding where to buy, but I think the big developers out there spend a lot of time understanding what's who the end product is. And I think now more than ever, with a lot of investors out of the market, it's really knowing who that end buyer is, because that's the key to everything with development, selling the apartments and knowing what price to sell them at. So I think research is the key for development at any time, but particularly at the moment.
Thank you. So, Rich, back to yourself. You both source and also run smaller scale infill development projects. What are you seeing are the trends there in regards to specifically what is now called the missing middle, with regards to changing product type, that is no longer the backyard and it's no longer the units, but it's that bit in the middle?
Yeah, there's been a real lack of supply, particularly for downsizers who don't like to move too far away from where they live. They love the place where they live. They've got their social network, they've got their activities, they've got their parks, and there's a real lack of choice for people downsizing or wanting to move out of the family home into something else. So that's what they call the missing middle, low density, also medium density housing. So, you know, apartments and townhouses, they're fairly low rise type developments. So the government has made an initiative to create more of that, although I think how many councils, 56 councils put a moratorium on it for 12 months until they work out exactly how that planning legislation is going to run. But there's just a lack of opportunities in that market. So the opportunity is there for the investor to do a thing like a duplex. We help a lot of our clients to do granny flats and to do duplexes and subdivisions, and they're highly profitable if you can pick the right area. We're doing quite a few of them in Newcastle as well, and different parts around Sydney. During probably the early, I'm trying to think of the years, probably 2009 to about 2013, we did over 300 granny flats for a lot of our clients. And all of those clients at the time were getting about 9 to 10% yields in Sydney, which is amazing. So they'd get the house and then the flat, and the combined yield would get a gross yield of 9 to 10%. All those people have now doubled their money and now looking to invest in something else. So things like duplexes and subdivisions are a great way to go. So I think the opportunity, there are specific opportunities even in this market where we're not seeing great capital growth, even price reductions. If you have the skill to do a small development, you can still create your own equity. And I think that's one of the points of today's seminar, is to actually say, how do you make money in this kind of environment where the market's not going up, in fact going down? How do you create money? Well, you'd have to manufacture that equity by doing a development or by doing a renovation or creating some sort of value-adding technique. That's a really quick summary, about an hour's presentation that I normally do, but that's essentially the guts of what you have to do in this kind of changing market to make money.
And as I understand it, that is your keynote presentation for tomorrow, correct?
I'm talking about how to capitalise on Sydney's infrastructure boom. So following the infrastructure gravy train, what are the pockets of Sydney that are going to do really well? So I'm talking about tomorrow at 3:30.
Very good. Ian, to yourself, you address a very specific segment of that missing middle, which is a little bit alternate to some of the other more traditional approaches. Tell us a little bit about how you've approached the problem.
Yeah, I mean, that was loud. Australia's got this massive problem. We hold the trophy for building the largest houses in the world at 246 square metres. In each one of those houses is 2.5 people. Tonight we've got 12 million empty bedrooms with a population of 25 million and 116,000 homeless people tonight. Like, we can fix housing affordability really easy if we take those existing bedrooms and retrofit them and make smaller micro apartments. And so essentially there's policies all over the country that allow you to take larger houses, divide them into smaller components. Most places you can get a private certification approval. So essentially it's a self-assessable application so that you go to a certifier, they sign off on it, and you can start operating. There's some fire and safety installations that have to happen, but essentially, it's in that. I mean, I'd also like to add that, what Andrew said is absolutely correct. The banks are just being crazy. Yes, they're going to get hounded. I also believe APRA made a massive mistake in that marketplace. And APRA, what they did to me as a sophisticated, full-time investor that does some pretty large projects, they essentially said across the board, we're not going to lend money to you anymore because you've got so many loans. We're going to calculate at 8.8% principal and interest across all of your loans when I'm paying 4.3, 4.4%. And so those mum and dad investors that turned up with no loans to their name, built the market and actually pushed it through the ceiling, and us developers are standing at the back of the auction going, what are you doing? You're absolutely destroying this marketplace. And so that's my bugbear.
So wholeheartedly concur. Anyone disagree with that statement?
Oh, no.
Okay, thank you. Which plays very perfectly into the next question, and I think Andrew has already asked that with his previous one, but in either case I'll go through it again. Bank lending conditions are challenging at the moment, so do you see that being sustainable in the long term?
Well, banks have to lend at the end of the day, and it's almost lemming-like what they're doing. They're saying, well, we're not going to lend, that's pushing the market down, and then they're going to say, well, the market's down, so we're not going to lend, so then the market goes down again, and then, well, we're not going to lend because the market's down. Now, we'll probably need a Royal Commission into that, and, it's easy to sort of joke about these things, but rightly, this all started, with the APRA nonsense 3 years ago when APRA decided that we had too many investors. This was particularly a Sydney problem when 65% of the market were investors in Sydney. So across the board, of course, the banks followed up the APRA suggestions of tightening rates. Now, investors now in Sydney make up around 48% of the market, which is around about the average long-term level. So the market's sort of moderated. But at the end of the day, it's created this rolling momentum of negativity. And the real cloud cuckoo land stuff of all of this is that the reason APRA increased rates or tightened lending for investors was as a risk management proposal. And the risk was around about higher interest rates. That's 3 years ago. What's happened, guys? You're the only ones who've raised interest rates. In fact, we're still, looking at the prospect of lower rates. So it's just crazy stuff, and unfortunately, it's created the momentum of the mindset that's infecting the market at the moment.
Perfect, thank you. So, Guillaume, yesterday you and I were discussing that at the bigger end of town, developers actually control property rather than owning it, which is one way to actually bypass the banks. We actually teach that exact same strategy at Property Developer Network, but for our audience's benefit, how does that actually work by controlling the property in order to bypass the banks?
Oh, look, I mean, the value when you buy a property is buying the raw land and getting the approval. So if you can delay the time you put the money down for the site and actually create the value through that period is the key strategy. A number of ways to do that. The most common one is the call option approach. So that's a right you have to buy the property. So I imagine most of you, when you buy a property, you go in, you pay 10% deposit, and you might try and settle a property in 6 weeks like you do on apartments. Developers will always buy time. Time is key to increasing value. If you get a delayed settlement, quite often 12 months, 18 months is achievable. In the market now, we're hearing even up to 2-3 years, even 4-year settlements in some areas where the landowner, as long as they're getting their premium, they're happy to sit on it. So you can negotiate the land price in a delayed payment. The simplest way is a call option, like I said, which is where you have the right to purchase the property. You don't have to. You can do that on a 1% deposit, and you don't have to pay anything else until you exercise that option. It could be 12, 18 months, or even 3 years. I mean, there's more complicated ways. You can do it what they call project development agreements, and that's what the big guys are very good at. Where they'll tie up a whole heap of landowners on a long-term agreement, where they don't own the land. They then develop the land in conjunction with the landowner. It's not a JV because there's not the risk in taking the sales risk, but it's more a deferred payment of the land, and the land doesn't actually transact from the landowner to the developer. They very much control the land in that sense. So they're just two strategies which developers use: the call option or project development agreements. So they're quite common, those strategies.
Yeah, correct. And some of the benefits we see, I guess, in our teachings of that is you can quite often pay more for the land because you've got savings in your holding costs, and you really just pay for that at the back end. So the vendor wins, the developer wins from a cash flow position. Everyone actually gets a better outcome.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, Richard, in your business, you're sourcing a lot of development sites. Tell the audience a little bit about the New South Wales strategic initiative, this Greater Sydney Regional Plan, and how Parramatta, Sydney itself, and I'm forgetting the third one now. Penrith, sorry. Just having a brain fade. My humble apologies. So how are those three turning into a major metropolis, being one giant city, and some of the infrastructure upgrades associated with that?
Well, if you read the Greater Metropolitan Sydney Plan, the goal is to have what they call the 30-minute city. So you've got the Sydney CBD, Parramatta, and Penrith, and you've got other major regional centres around that. So what the government is doing is creating massive transport infrastructure nodes so they can have the movement of people and goods and communities more freely. So, I mean, you just walk out the door these days and you see a new hospital or a new road. I mean, just up the road from me, the Northern Beaches Hospital opened up on Tuesday. You know, that was a $600 million development, 455 beds. They're doing about $1 billion of roadworks out the front, which still are 12 months behind. A bit of a nightmare. But I guess from the perspective of a home buyer or investor, how do you capitalise on that? You look for areas that are going through what's called gentrification. So areas that are being rezoned also for higher densities. And when you have areas that are opened up by faster transport networks, by either a new train or a bus line or some other kind of motorway, you find that property prices are really underpinned. I mean, an example of this was the M2. When the M2 was opened up, I forget what year it was, Borkham Hill median prices jumped about 30% that year. So it was quite remarkable just how when people discovered that, wow, the travel time's been cut by 20 minutes, it's quite remarkable how much that really underpins property prices. So the trick for you as an investor and potentially as a home buyer, because your home is also a great investment, is to look at the Sydney Metro Plan and identify the areas where there's going to be a lot of new transport infrastructure that will underpin property prices and create a better efficiency in transport.
Very good. Guillaume, back to yourself. Obviously, you're dealing again with the bigger end of town. We've touched on two themes here with the Greater Sydney Regional Plan and also the missing middle, which is, I would speculate, a little bit small for your guys, but right in the sweet spot for these guys.
Oh, look, I mean, we cover Sydney geographically from the harbour all the way through to Penrith. But no, look, I think that middle ring suburbs is where the opportunity is. I mean, we spoke about supply peaking, and where the level we're at now was only repeated, I think, in 1971 or 72. And we're actually going to see a big fall in supply in many areas. So 20% fall next year and 20% fall the year after that. But a lot of the supply, when you look around, they're big gentrification, regeneration suburbs. Activation precincts is a term the government used. You see those in Epping, Quarry Park, the Sydney Olympic Park. So those areas where a lot of development's been focused. But where we're focusing a lot of time now are in the traditional core areas. So, I mean, real estate is a need purchase as opposed to, or is a primary need purchase. And I think you target those areas where people need to live and where people are going to live. Empty nesters are a massive part of our market at the moment. People, like we said, don't want to leave far from where their family is. So those middle ring areas are very, very important. And there's great opportunity to develop those. We're doing a lot of work now in strata amalgamation, where there's strata blocks which sit on a large parcel of land. So, if you live in a strata apartment, look at the size of your land and look at how much density you have on the building, and there's often a premium that can be achieved by getting together as a group of owners to develop your apartment block. So the middle suburbs has got huge opportunity, and that's where we're spending most of our time at the moment, chasing those core residential areas.
Absolutely, and on that strata side of things, for those who aren't aware, the legislation is that in the past, if you're in a unit complex, you needed 100% of the unit buyers to actually sell in order to sell onto a developer. Now it's only 75% of that complex needs to agree to sell. So there's a lot more opportunity.
It takes away that before it was 100%, people could, it was just too hard, but now 75%, it does open up the opportunity, and if you're one of the owners that don't want to sell, unfortunately you've got to listen to your neighbours. It is a very long, difficult process, but it has opened up a lot of regeneration of older strata apartment buildings that need to be converted. I mean, a lot of these buildings were built in the 50s and 60s, and there's time for them to go.
Absolutely, and the sum of the whole is quite often worth more than the individual units.
Quite often, when we go speak to owners, we're targeting a double premium. I mean, we sold a property in Neutral Bay 2 months ago, 8 strata apartments. Average price probably 1.2, 1.5 through the building. They each got $3 million average per apartment. So that's a massive game changer for these blocks. And if you can get in early and buy an apartment in a good area, look for those type of properties that can be developed later on. There's huge profits to be made in strata now.
Very good. Ian, you've got a passion for empowering people on their property journey. What would you say would be the one biggest lesson that you would want to impose on people with regards to investing in themselves?
I think that you have to look at holistically about not just the property itself. What is it that you want at the back end of it? And if that means you don't want to be in paid employment anymore, if that means that you just want to go out and do some charity work, start with that end goal and work your way back. And like I said earlier, going out and just buying a property for property's sake or the hope that it's going to go up for you is really the worst strategy you could possibly do. And I think everything that's been said here is all of part of what I'm saying. Make sure you can go out and be strategic and pick up stuff that's not at full purchase price, but control the site rather than picking it up. Rich is saying about the infrastructure and education and learning around that. And, Dr. Wilson here is, quite clearly saying that the metrics are good. It's just that the surrounding parts of that. So what would I say? Go out, get some education, learn what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Pick some really great mentors to follow, and don't be afraid to spend money on the education, because it will save you at the back end. I often use this quote: if you want to find out how expensive it is to use a mentor, don't use one at all.
Very good, thank you. I'll just remind the audience, we will take some questions from the crowd. I notice that there's no spare microphone, so what I would encourage, if I will share my microphone, anyone wanting a question, if they could just line up here, I'll happily share between. Don't be shy, folks. This is your session after all. I've lost my place, I apologise. Andrew, so back to yourself. Yep. There's some pent-up demand for stock on the near horizon, but would you say that's more owner-occupier stock or investor stock?
Well, I think that investors still have a strong appetite for property in Sydney. Why wouldn't you? I mean, it is the most expensive city for a reason, and that's the price proposition of value. As we spoke before, all the key drivers that you need to fertilise, I guess, a housing market are there. Strongest economy, strong migration, and low interest rates. And also we're becoming a more affordable city because first-home buyers are into the market as we haven't seen them for a long time. So it's actually appealing as quite a balanced market. And, the other point is that 40% of our housing is investor stock, are people who rent. And our rental markets are supplied by the private sector. I think there's more a realisation from investors that perhaps the future lies, as Ian was saying, on a return on investment such as yield, as much as capital growth. And in a low growth, low yield environment that we have now in our economy, I think that's going to be even more of a driver for investors. But our investor numbers have fallen away sharply, but at 48% of the market, we're still 10% ahead of any of the other cities. I think that says it all, that we've sort of gone through the big hit of these rate rises and lending restrictions directed at Sydney investors, and we still remain considerably as a higher proportion of lending, investor activity, compared to the other capital city markets. And Sydney still, or New South Wales still makes up 49% of all investor lending in the country. So I think that the appetite is there, and I think savvy investors will start to realise that opportunity is knocking down, quite seriously.
Very good. I might open this next question up to the entire panel. I guess from how I see it, there's actually three different kinds of investors out there. So there's passive investors who tend to buy and hold and hope and pray. There's active investors who actually go and manufacture that profit. And then there's the people in the middle who passively invest, but they invest in the active deals. So out of those three approaches, I think we probably cover that entire spectrum here. So I'd be interested to hear perspectives on good, bad and indifferent on each of those from your own, I guess, specialties in those areas.
Well, I'll kick it off if you like. I guess there's also three people in life. There are those that go, I'll make things happen. There's others that just go, what happened? And it's all gone past them. And others that really get proactive. But I think to answer your question, the active investor is probably the best one, because think of the food chain. If you're just a passive investor and you're buying a brand new end product, you're right at the end of the food chain. If you're someone that takes raw land, gets a DA, you're adding the maximum amount of value. Or if you're that middle person that Rob's talking about, you're the person participating in that activity. So I guess it just comes down to the level of the buyer or the investor's level of risk, their knowledge, and how much money and time they're prepared to put into that activity. For myself as a buyer's agent, we help people at every stage of that journey. So we can act as a mentor and a guide to people looking to get onto that value-adding chain, help them all the way through. But I think as an investor, you've got to learn to walk before you run. One of the mistakes I made very early in my career was to go and buy a very, very big development site with a JV partner that I thought had money but didn't have money. Anyway, it all went pear-shaped. So make sure if you're going to do joint ventures or you're going to do an activity, you team up with the right people who have the right credentials, and you know how much time and effort it's going to take to get into that process before you start. But for my money, in this market, the value-adding route is the best one to go. So it might be as simple as buying a strata unit and doing a small renovation. It might be improving the kitchen and the bathrooms. That could be a really clever way to go, just to get your foot in the door. Also, the other thing I'll say is buying established property, in my view, is a far better way to make money in this market than buying brand new property. Might be something controversial to say here at the Property Expo, but in my view, that's the way in which I've typically made a lot more of my money. Buying off the plan typically only works at very, very small stages of the property cycle when you're starting the upswing of the cycle. Unless you can get massive discounts, which I think some developers are going to be offering in the next 12 months. So that's my money, a couple of ways investors can get in the market.
Very good. I can see Guillaume itching to say something next.
I think I deal with a lot of developers. We have thousands of developers on our database, small and big. But I think in times like these, where it is getting a little bit more challenging, it's you hear the term flight to quality, or just going back to what's comfortable, going back to the areas you know. I mean, the best agents, the best developers that I deal with control an area. So they work specifically in a targeted area. They know everything in that area. I mean, we're in our business now where we like the lower North Shore. We spend a lot of time through Neutral Bay, Camaray, Cremorne. So even in my business, we're going around seeing all the opens that all the agents have got. It might be McGrath, might be another agent. We want to know what's happening at the coalface. We want to know what's happening in the apartment sales market, because that ultimately drives the rest of the feasibility. It's a top-down approach. Work out where you're going to sell it, and there's a lot of risks on the way. But if you get that top line right, a lot of the development will flow. So I think if you're going to be an active developer, you're starting out, just work where it's comfortable, work where you know, and get to know that market very, very well.
Absolutely. Andrew?
Well, look, I think that maybe a little controversial to say that I think the era of the hotspot is gone. You understand what I mean? I think that sort of passive investor is now going to be just about solely the investor profile going forward, and I think that's a good thing. I think the government and times have moved in that direction. I think that investors are now about relationship building with their tenants, and I think it's now we've got the capacity to have a longer lease, and there's more security of tenure for tenants. And I think landlords, strangely enough, have been looking for this anyway. And I think that that relationship will work its way into creating this longer-term view of property investor, particularly from small typically small investors that will look towards perhaps maintaining, and I think in these market circumstances it's not too much of a, out on a limb to say net 5% yields with capital growth and rental yields over the longer term. And I think 5% is going to look like a pretty good figure given the options in terms of asset classes that we have, I guess added to by the relationship building that you have in terms of certainty. I mean, stock market's gone backwards, that means your super's going to go backwards. Income growth is the lowest we've seen. But I think that the nature of our housing markets are that they will, through the longer terms, always be undersupplied. And there's always going to be barriers to home ownership, which will keep that sort of 40-60 balance there. And I think that's the point that the privately funded rental market means that it becomes more of a strength for that passive investor going forward to accrue what will, not looking backwards but looking forwards, will be quite robust and consistent returns on rental properties, particularly established properties. But I think new is also, I don't think we should sideline the value of new. I'm finishing, because we are more and more inclined to be apartment dwellers anyway. That's a growing trend, not just because of affordability or proximity. I think we're looking to the apartment lifestyle. I think that will suit developers as well.
Yeah.
I don't believe in passive investment at all. I mean, if you're going to be offered an end-of-the-line product that's going to give you guaranteed rent for 2 years, run 1,000 miles, because what they're doing is trying to sell your property on the yield that quite likely won't be the yield in 2 years' time once the rental guarantee finishes. I know it's a little controversial, but I'll say that up front. I think pick someone that's going to teach you how to do this, that is doing it on a daily basis as well. Like right now, Rob's on Facebook showing people that he's doing a subdivision, his feet are in the dirt. 3 weeks ago, I showed live on Facebook in a 48-hour challenge that I could convert an existing property that was renting for $350. We spent $18,000 on it, and it now rents for $21,000 more per year for the rest of the time that homeowner owns that property, right? So, Rich is there showing people how to do it and working your way. In the end, you have to know how to do it. Stop trying to buy fish and actually get the fishing rod and get out there and doing it for yourself. And I think Rich also said, and it's something that I've said for many years, I would rather go out and do 20 duplexes than a 40-lot subdivision. Your exposure is less, you've got you haven't got all your eggs in one basket, and I always say, start small and then start to roll on from that. You'll gain experience, you'll learn things like there's property deals that'll come up and things that'll happen that you just couldn't imagine that will happen. But along the way, once you get that educated, that experience, another feather in your cap, it gets you onto the bigger one, bigger one, bigger one. I didn't start with a 10-hectare subdivision like we're doing right now. I started with a simple little 1 into 2 project, and we worked our way up.
Very good, thank you. I might add to that if that's okay. I tend to concur with the accumulative opinion across the table here, and that is that investing in property, for me at least, is not where I make my money, but rather it's where I park my money once I've made it. So I manufacture the profit, and then I roll it into an investment where it just becomes a regular income stream from then forward. And I would highly encourage the crowd to consider that sort of approach themselves. We've got about 5 minutes to go. As I said, questions from the floor. If somebody would like to come up, just line up here and I will share the microphone. Thank you. Introduce your name, who your question is for, then pass the mic back. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Fawad. This is for the whole panel. This is for the whole panel. My name is Fawad. It's just there are two parts of the question. One is there are news that New South Wales Premier, she wants to cut down the immigration to half in Sydney, and there are also news that the new immigrants, they may not be allowed to stay in Sydney and Melbourne for 5 years and need to go somewhere else. So that's the first part. Second part is, property is growing, as you said, 10% in Sydney for the last 5 years, but the income is not growing. Like salaried people, their income is not growing 10% every year. So there will be some time when people actually say, I can't afford living in Sydney anymore. So those two aspects, how you guys think gonna impact the property market in Sydney and Melbourne in the future?
I'll kick in really quickly. First thing, doesn't matter if immigration stops in Sydney. I think Dr. Wilson clearly disagrees. I think that centralising the way that we've done in Australia has actually created an affordability issue. So I don't mind that it actually distributes. And in answer to your second question about affordability in Sydney not being able to go anywhere, currently the second most unaffordable city in the world is Hobart. Housing according to the cost of housing to their income, and so why? Because people are moving back to their home state, and immigration is going that way anyway. So I don't think it's a problem.
I'll just jump on the immigration number. I think immigration is an absolutely critical factor for the health of the property market going forward. In the last couple of years we've been having migration levels around 242,000 for 16, 17 years. That's a fundamental driver of our property market. If immigration is cut to half, you watch prices drop further, because we don't have enough natural increase in Australia to really pump our property markets and the rest of the economy for that matter. The reason Australia is so prosperous is because we welcome our arms to immigrants. We have a wonderful economy, a wonderful society because of that. So I encourage the government to increase that. The other point about affordability, yes, it is obviously very difficult to live in a premier city from an affordability point of view. So that's why there are other options. So living in smaller apartments, living in the middle suburbs, but there are other options. There's no one solution for that, but it's an ongoing issue.
I think just on the immigration point, it's politically motivated. It's just the Premier coming out saying something that people want to hear. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a NIMBYism that's come back into the market. It was only 12 months ago that we were talking about affordability and we needed more supply. But now, I think the biggest mistake that happened in New South Wales was the cancellation, the amalgamation of the councils. That was a fundamental change in the market, in my opinion, what we operate in. The councils became empowered, and they pushed back enormously on the state government, which is doing great things in providing supply and fixing the housing problem. So the state government doesn't control migration anyway, so it's a federal function. So it's just politically motivated rhetoric, just with the election coming up.
I'll try to keep this to half an hour, Rob. No, just quickly. Look, we've got to celebrate immigration, and quite clearly, it's very cynical that with elections now approaching, the immigration card has been played, because there is a rump out there that is anti-immigrant, and of course, we'll vote in favour of parties that restrict immigration. It's just a fact of life. We do have an element of xenophobia in this country, but the facts are quite clear that the energy from our economy last year, which enabled the government to, can you believe, almost pay off our deficit, plus give us some tax relief, was, even though it was pretty small, was driven by the highest migration we've had in a decade. And that migration created more jobs, which created more tax receipts from PAYE earners. It's clear, they said it in the budget papers. Now, they're playing with fire in a sense, because fewer migrants will mean fewer jobs, which will mean fewer tax receipts, which will again put pressure on our deficit. Now, of course, we need to be able to match immigration with appropriate infrastructure and housing. That's the balancing act, that we need to do that. We don't want people living in the streets or impacting affordability, which can happen, of course. But we certainly need migration as a driver, not just of our housing markets, but of our economy. It's very important, and it's what's really kept us with our head above water post the mining boom.
Hello. It seems that there's going to be a tsunami of investors who got very cheap money, interest only, through our favourite banks, and they're going to find that they're going to have to go on to principal plus interest and not be able to pay for that. What factors are there that's going to prevent that catastrophe from happening? And should I just be saving my cash ready for the crash?
I'll answer this one and just chip in. Yeah, I think, look, there's been this, warning that all these investors that have been on interest only are suddenly going to have to flood the market with their properties. I know for my whole portfolio, I've switched mine over to P&I a couple of years ago, and I've been paying down the debt. I think the other factor for a lot of investors, they've already got a lot of equity in their property. Now, if they were smart, they should have set up an offset account or created some sort of buffer knowing this was coming. So it's only going to be pretty much the ones who are sort of out in the wilderness are going to find themselves in trouble. I don't think it's going to be a massive tsunami of properties that are going to hit the market because everyone's switching to interest only. I think, sure, there'll be some that'll struggle to refinance, but I don't think it's going to be as big a problem as what it's made out to be.
I mean, to answer your other question about, save your cash or sit on or buy, I think it's been said today, we do a lot of project marketing, we have some great sites across Sydney, in good areas. Just go shopping, go ask the question. I mean, it's the best time to do it now. We're telling all our sales guys, encourage offers, just go out there and ask and try and buy something. I mean, all I can say is no, but I think it's a good time to go out and ask questions and shop and have a look around what's available.
And property cycles don't act as one across the country. So Sydney's in its own cycle, Melbourne does its own cycle. So, I went to Tassie 2 years ago because I haven't bought since 2013. Now, I probably was 18 months out. I probably could have done another 18 months in Sydney. But, you watch cycles, and so Perth and Darwin, Perth's come off the bottom and Darwin's just about to. So, you start to look at that. Now, don't go out and buy in Perth and Darwin because I said so. Look at the metrics, understand why you should be buying there and using your money. So, I look at my money and I go, where do I go to according to? And I know we're in a Sydney venue right here, but again, I think there's a period of time for me, probably 18 months before I'll start to reinvest heavily into Sydney.
And look, just to add, I think to validate what Rich said, that those investors that have to turn over their interest-only loans, which typically are 3 or 4 years, if they did purchase 3 or 4 years ago, I think the least of their concerns would be having to find another loan because their equity position would surely be very, very strong, regardless of whether they had an offset loan or not.
Very good. So, lucky last opportunity for a question from the crowd, if there is one. Quick. Very good. So, name and who the question's for, please.
I have one question. My name is Yang, sorry. I have one question. It's just one sentence. Why the new development is so small for upsider young family and so small for downsider? Yeah. It's confused, I feel. This
So, did you get that?
Yes.
So I'll repeat the question. So why are so many of the developments so small in size? Because it doesn't really suit young families.
Look, I think it's changing. I think it's certainly low and offshore where we're active. Developers have flipped where they're now planning for 130, 140, 150 square metre apartments, 3-bedders, 90, 100 square metre 2-bedrooms. So I think it's led by the buyer demand, and for downsizers and first home buyers in the market, you'll see the product shifting much more to that.
Yeah, look, I agree, and I think that's part of that process, as I sort of alluded to before, is that there is a growing demand for apartment living, and it's not just the usual profile of investors looking for early stage career singles, renters, business couples. It's also families and increasingly downsizers that are looking for more substantial properties, 2-3 bedroom, to sort of finish their property career in after they move out of the big house, which I think is a good thing from Ian's perspective, as he alluded to all those empty, larger homes, that if we can shift them, and there's now incentives to do that in terms of superannuation for over 65s, if you can shift them into apartments, which I think is increasingly becoming more attractive, I think it's sort of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. But I think absolutely right that Dion said that developers are moving towards a different profile in terms of the building footprint to suit different buyer types.
So we don't need more bigger housing. We need smaller housing. The market is upside down. Okay, so I build 22 to 35 square metre homes, and they fill in seconds, and they get double, triple the rent of what I would get in the same size house as an investor. So we don't need more family homes. We need to be able to cater for the singles and couples that make up the majority of our marketplace. And yes, an adaptable house is probably more appropriate. So we build 4-bedroom houses in one of our development. That's a studio, a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom. They're all attached. They've all got kitchens. And a young couple can buy this, live in the studio, rent out the other 2, pay down their debt, and then when they have a child, move into the bigger one. When they have another child, they take up 2 sections. If they're like me and they have 4 daughters, they take the whole lot. And then when they kick the daughters out, they start to downsize, or what we call up life, because once the kids are gone, life is good.
I can't beat that, but I think you'll see you see the old manor home, which is I think was prominent, probably 30, 40 years ago. I think they were longer, but the manor home's coming back into vogue now, and it's part of the new legislation with the missing middle. So I think you'll find in high density areas the manor home coming back, which is just a house split up into 4 apartments. And I've got some friends who live in them, and they're fantastic. So I think that manor home concept is something which all of you can do in your relevant suburbs. And to Ian's point, having multiple income streams of one property is quite smart.
Absolutely, and just from my point of view, this is precisely that missing middle that we were talking about a little bit earlier, where I guess big home, very small apartment, it's the bit in the middle. And while the market was booming ahead and people were making lots of money and people selling the small homes really quickly, people kept developing them because they were going so quick. Now there's I guess a change in that cycle, and people are actually got that demand for that missing middle. I think you'll see that stock kind of land in the middle a little bit more in the coming years. So that's it, everybody. So thank you very much for your time. I'd like to individually thank Guillaume Volz, Rich Harvey, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Ian Ugarte, and I've been Rob Flux. And thank you very much for your time.